Good evening and welcome. I'm Ritu Sethi, Director, League of Artisans. Established in 2022, the League of Artisans, a not-for-profit, works alongside artisans to give voice for a more dignified future for people and planet. As a new organization, albeit with longitudinal experiences of the founders and of our global advisors, our core methodology is collaborative, responding to global challenges by mobilizing the power of co-creation, building networks, and the amplification of artisan voices. We advocate for the transformational power of collective knowledge to bring wider and deeper impacts to larger numbers, thereby providing a vital response to transforming futures and to global challenges. So on behalf of my co-directors, Saul Maranucci and Carrie Summers, and our Artisan Advisory Board, I welcome you all to our 5th webinar that is a run-up to the first ever Textile Week to be held in Leek from 23rd to 29th September. The webinar today is titled Beyond Microfibres, the Hidden Impact of Textiles on Waterways. And while news reports are flooded with data on polluted waterways, and as we become more aware as citizens, for not only do we read these reports, but we can also taste and often can see it in our local waters, it boils down to the question, what can I or my community do about it? Well, the good news is that there are people working on it, researching, testing, and bringing their findings to light. And there are others too who are actively, practically on the ground, changing things around. And these are the voices you will hear on the League of Artisans webinar today. But before I hand over to our speakers, just a few nuts and bolts to fix. First, thank you for responding to the online poll that was posted at the start. Please do also post your questions to the panelists on the Q&A link below. And if you would like a specific speaker to respond, do specify who you are addressing the question to. Also, if you have comments and suggestions, please add them to the chat box, in which you will note we have added some useful links, including those of the 55 events lined up during the Leek Textile Week. So do please check and reserve your seats. And now on to the main event. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, my colleague and co-director on the League of Artisans, Carrie Summers. A force for change in the fashion industry, Carrie is a globally recognized entrepreneur, activist, speaker, and writer. Her career in fashion began accidentally in the early 90s when a summer holiday project grew into an award-winning brand, Pachacuti, a pioneer of radical supply chain transparency and the world's first fair trade certified company. As a founder of Fashion Revolution, the world's largest fashion activism movement, she has been instrumental in pressurizing the industry to take responsibility for its social and environmental impacts. In 2022, she co-founded League of Artisans. She has been named by Business of Fashion as one of the key people shaping the global fashion industry. She holds an MA in Native American Studies, an honorary Doctor of Letters from Keele University, and is a 2023 Churchill Fellow. Over to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Ritu. Great, just sharing my screen. So the hidden impact of textiles on our waterways, beyond microfibres. We've chosen this title because addressing the true scope of textile pollution requires us to look beyond the obvious. While microfibres are a well-known issue, they're just one piece in a much larger puzzle. There are numerous ways in which our textiles impact the waterways, but there's just as many potential solutions. To give you some context for this webinar, it stems from the Restoring Riverscapes project, which we ran 3 years ago when I was the Global Operations Director at Fashion Revolution. And we were focusing on the rivers and the lake around Leek in Staffordshire, where we are soon to hold our first Textile Week. In our first years at Fashion Revolution, we focused on the question, who made my clothes? But I knew that we needed to push brands to act urgently on the environmental as well as social responsibility. And that's why we started asking the question, what's in my clothes? And it was this question which carried me on a 2,000-mile sailing voyage in early 2020 from the Galapagos to Easter Island, one of the world's most remote inhabited islands, carrying out scientific research into the devastating environmental impact of plastics and toxic chemicals in our oceans. And my mission was to find out more about the life of our clothes, where they come from and where they go in their circuitous journeys beyond our wardrobe. Because you see, polyester, acrylic, nylon and other synthetic fibres comprise close to 60% of all of the clothes in our wardrobes, and it's going up every year. And all clothes shed fibres when we wash them and when we wear them. And most of these fibres aren't captured during the laundry process by our washing machines or our tumble dryers. And so many of these then find their way out into the aquatic environment. So on next expedition, we spent hours every day dropping a manta trawl, we had a Niskin bottle, and we were analysing the results. And every trawl brought up more and more plastic. There was flecks of orange, blue, yellow, green. There was spirals, clear spirals, as you can see in the sample bottle here. And these colourful fragments were the small but significant remnants of a trail of plastic waste that lies in the wake of uncontrolled growth. And it was also a stark reminder that every action has a consequence. We may not always see it. As our knowledge of the harmful effects of synthetic textiles grows, natural textile fibres made from plants, animals, even fungi are widely promoted as biodegradable alternatives to synthetics. And yes, they can provide some solutions, but their impact has been mostly neglected in scientific studies of marine and freshwater pollution, as you'll be hearing later on from Tom and Tony in particular. And so 2 years after my sailing voyage to Easter Island, I was once again back on water, and this time I was on Rudyard Lake, just a stone's throw from where I live here in Staffordshire, exploring how historic textile production affects the local water ecosystems today. Now, the nearby town of Leek, for those of you who are joining from further afield, became really well known for its silk and its dye works, due to the purity of the water in the River Churnet. But over time, with dozens of mills and dye works pumping out their effluent into the river, it became known as the most polluted river in the whole of Europe. You might have heard the saying that you can tell the it colour for the season by looking at the colour of the rivers in China. Well, the same was true in Leek. My friend Geoffrey, who was a dye works apprentice in 1955, remembers how the colour changed. The river changed colour about 3 times a week, depending on what colour the bigger dye works were dyeing upstream. So working alongside Tom, Tony, Deirdre, I helped to collect a sediment sample you can see here. And we also collected samples of water from the River Churnet. And later, as our citizen scientists looked down the microscopes, it became apparent that many of these fibres had once been dyed. And I can remember seeing a blue fibre, possibly the one you can see on your screens here, and it had a distinctive twist. It really looked like it came from a pair of jeans. And all of this begs the question, was it the colours, was it the chemicals that were stopping these so-called natural fibres from breaking down? And so I started to think more about solutions, about radical visions of how our clothes could be made in more regenerative, cooperative and circular ways. what if natural fibres really were natural and disappeared readily back into the earth again? And I began to wonder if it wasn't time to sift away some of the debris and start to expose fashion's roots. And then the renewal can begin again from the ground up. And so this led me to the RHS Chelsea Flower Show, which you can see here, in an attempt to raise awareness of fashion's environmental impact. For the first time, we created the first ever textile garden using solely the plants that can be used to make and dye our clothes. Designed by Lottie de la Main, the garden inspired all of the hundreds of thousands of visitors to the show to reimagine the link between what we can grow and what we wear. And then after I stepped down from Fashion Revolution, I applied for a Churchill Fellowship. And I spent last October and November in Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico, interviewing artisans, visionaries, activists, guardians of the forest, plant pioneers, and exploring the potential within plant fibres and dyes. Now, you may not know this, but cotton doesn't only come in white. In Peru, Yolanda, who you can see here, dreamed of reviving the native coloured cotton. She felt the threads drawing her back to her mother, her grandmother before, and she also saw coloured cotton as an opportunity, an escape from the drudge of the chicken factory where she worked every day. But there was just one problem, well, maybe two. Native coloured cotton was banned by the government for fear of cross-contamination with their lovely white commercial variety, and nobody had any seeds because it had been banned for many years. But Yolanda isn't someone to let something like that stand in her way. So she searched through pillows, pillowcases, and scoured the hedgerows, looking for plants, looking for seeds, because of course they stuffed all their cushions and pillows with the cotton as well, and some of the seeds might still have been able to create new plants. And she found some and she started growing the cotton. So she planted a field of pure white Pima cotton, the kind that was allowed, around the outside. And in the middle, she grew her native cotton, her cotton of the countryside. And this is her cultural heritage. For 8 years, she persisted, storing her cotton and waiting for the ban to be lifted. Since then, she's brought 5 colours back from the brink of extinction, including the darkest chestnut I've ever seen. And the government of Peru has had U-turn, declaring coloured cotton as the genetic, ethnic, and cultural heritage of the country. Native coloured cotton has a short staple fibre, but I also met researchers who are crossbreeding it with organic cotton to try and increase the length of the fibre. Jeans are the most commonly worn item of clothing in the world, and most of them are made from cotton. And I was also really keen to find out more about the natural indigo's ability to compete with synthetic indigo. Now, the latter's chemical building blocks include formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide, and aniline. And as I arrived at Los Nacimientos in El Salvador, one of only 2 certified organic indigo farms in the world, I couldn't help wondering if those fibres we found in Rudyard Lake would still have been there if we'd used natural rather than synthetic indigo. And then later with the Unesha in the rainforest, Vabi shared her memories about how her great-grandmother used to grow black cotton. And then when I was at a research university in Peru, I saw a photograph of blue cotton, and though nobody seemed to know its location. And as I watched and learned and listened, I started to imagine a world where we didn't even need to dye our jeans, where fashion was no longer the root of the problem, but it could start to grow the solutions. You can read my Churchill Fellowship report in the Ideas Library on the website, and I can drop a link in the chat as well if it's not there already. It takes the form of a dictionary of plant fibre and colour, and it lists close to 100 fibre and dye plants I came across on my travels, as well as the stories of some of the people I met. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Very inspiring. Our next speaker is Deirdre McKay. She is Professor of Sustainable Development at Keele University in the UK. She is a social scientist who applies qualitative research methods to interdisciplinary environmental problems. Her current projects explore textile fiber pollution, marine litter, and urban biodiversity. Over to you, Professor Deirdre.
Thank you, Ritu. So I'm going to be talking about the global impacts of textile fibers and their production and care, because I'm sort of suturing together, weaving together what Carrie set out about her journey and her research with the scientific work that my colleagues Antonia and Tom are going to present. So one of the points I want to make is what's happening in England, in the Midlands, is basically the aftermath of a historical industry. It's not actually that historical. It's, 40, 50 years ago when the rivers were still really polluted. But a lot of very similar practices, policies, and pollutants are now found in the centers of textile production in India, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in China. So it isn't a difference between what's actually happening in the global north and the global south. It's a difference in the timeline. So we, in our study that we did with Carrie in Leek in Staffordshire, we're sort of looking at post-textile industry rivers and their sediments. But we'd find the same things, we think, in India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, etc. So when you see something like this, and this is one of Carrie's photographs from South Asia, where you see dye in the gutters, you would also have seen it here in the old buildings from the sort of Victorian textile heyday in Leek and the River Churnet, which had many dye works along its banks. So this is the river that was different colors depending on the color of the season. And there were huge complaints in the media and amongst the public in the 80s and the 90s about the textile pollution in the Churnet, largely from dye, but also heat pollution and over-abstraction of water. So we actually had a look at what was in the river today. So there's Tony and her wonderful assistant, Tom, doing some water sampling in the Churnet, looking for textile fibers. And what we found is probably fibers that have come from laundry, from domestic laundry, possibly windborne. They'll tell you more about those. So that's what's in the water. But we also found, as Carrie said, historical fibers in the bottom of the lake in the sediment core. And this is really, really interesting because, as Carrie said, those so-called natural fibers that we would expect to have broken down in the environment didn't. And we need to find out if this was because of a low oxygen environment or if this was because of the way they had been processed and treated, and possibly the dyes that have been used. And Tom and Tony are going to tell you far more about that. But what I'm going to tell you about is what our citizen scientists working with us helped us figure out. And that was that healthy rivers are a global concern. The kinds and numbers of fibers that you're going to find in rivers, and the adsorbed toxicants, the nasty things stuck to them, and the health of the rivers and riverbank peoples are all entwined right around the world. So we found things in the historical record for Leek that would likely be true of all of those textile production centers that I mentioned that are part of our contemporary value chains. So the first global lesson is that you see migration and diversity around the textile industry. So you have a more diverse local population, you've got ethnic and regional representation that's different at different tiers in the workforce. And we saw that in Leek. We found that foreigners or outsiders to the local area were more likely to be in the better paid roles. They were actually more highly mobile trainers of others. Sometimes they brought in capital, or they were service providers. So there was a tiered workforce where local people often got some of the worst health-wise jobs. And then we found a lot of muddy water. And we've seen this right around the world. There is a recognized right to discharge for industry. And so effluent and sediment and washing out the industrial equipment, it all goes into the river. And then because the water quality is poor, that pollution is then used as a pretext for the industry to take out more water to dilute their effluent even further. So it's a bit of a logical problem that pollution actually ends up getting super concentrated in the river as the effluent at the point of entry is being diluted by abstracting better quality water upstream and washing it through again. And this, it's not making any more water. It's just changing the measurements at the end of factories' pipes. So this is something that we can see right around the world. And the other thing that we saw in Leek, which is likely true elsewhere, is that workers' housing and their sewage gets blamed for poor water quality, with industry actually then relying on the creation of substandard settlements for workers very, very close to the river's edge. So workers can't complain about the water quality because they're part of the problem, both because they're dependent on the factories for work, but also because they're housed in a way that's going to exacerbate the diminution of quality in the river water. Finally, and this was a bit of a good news story for Leek, to some extent, you can say that textile work is good work for women. We saw evidence that, particularly in the silk industry in Leek, local women became empowered both socially and economically because of the value of their skills. And this is something that is important to remember when we question why people want to protect these industries, why they value these jobs, and the artisanal skills and knowledge that lie behind them. So I am going to stop here and say thank you very much and turn over to my scientific colleagues to explain the methods and the significance of our findings in Leek, just reminding you that we can almost guarantee, I think, at this stage, that if we partnered with scientists in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India or China, we would find very, very similar things in their textile producing regions.
Thank you, Deirdre. It's so amazing how we are actually living in a flattened world. So our next presentation is a joint one by Tom Stanton and by Antonio Law, and I introduce both the speakers. Antonio Law is an assistant professor in geography at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Her research focuses on one of the biggest environmental challenges facing society today: the impact of anthropogenic activity, including climate change and pollution, on aquatic systems. Her current projects include working with interdisciplinary teams to understand the interactions between plastics, climate change, and lake ecosystems. Tom Stanton is a lecturer in geography at Loughborough University in the UK. His work lies at the nexus of human and physical geography, utilizing social science and environmental science methodologies to explore the social and environmental pathways, prevalence and impact of pollution in aquatic environments, with a particular specialization in material pollution. I think, Tom, you go first. Am I right?
Yeah. Thank you, Ritu. That's correct. Yeah, thank you all for joining us today. As has been said, Antonio and I are going to be co-delivering this presentation, but you'll note that there are a lot of other names on this screen, and our thanks go out to in particular, Dr. Chimdia Ketia Okafor and Dr. Kelly Sheridan, who can't be with us today, but who have been instrumental to this work. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the topic of natural textile fibres, or focusing on the topic of natural textile fibres, things like cotton and wool in aquatic environments. I'm going to talk you through the journey to how we, as a research team, started working in this space, and some of the knowns and the known unknowns associated with natural textile fibres in the environment. And then Tony's going to dig into a little bit more detail about our work on the Restoring Riverscapes project. I don't have control of the slides, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to keep on saying next slide, please. Thank you, Tony. So the first part of this journey begins with plastic pollution, and an interest in plastic pollution that stems from some earlier associated work that Antonia and myself were doing before we focused on fibres. There's a lot of work that has reported the environmental impact of plastic pollution, particularly big bits of plastic. So we know that these varied group of pollutants can be ingested by organisms. They can cause blockages and entanglement of gastrointestinal tracts of the organisms that ingest them. They can also cause entanglement. I use these fluffy toys here as sort of in lieu of some gruesome photos for most of my talks. But we also know that plastic pollution has chemical impact. So it can both act as a source of chemicals from the additives, the dyes, fire retardants, etc., that are used, and plasticizers that are used in its manufacture. And they can act as concentration points for other chemicals that may be dissolved in the environment or attached to other particulate matter that can latch onto the surface of plastics and then ultimately be transported not just through the environment, but again through organisms that ingest them. Next slide, please, Tony. And we know that the majority of plastic in the environment, in terms of number, if not mass, actually falls into the category of microplastic pollution, and more recently, potentially nanoplastics as well. So microplastics, if you aren't aware, are any pieces of plastic that are smaller than 5 millimeter in their largest dimension. And to give you an idea of scale, that's about the size of one of the circles on a plastic building brick. These pieces of plastic, these microplastics, are less likely to cause entanglement issues. But when it comes to the issues associated with ingestion and the transport of chemicals, their impacts are actually magnified relative to that of large pieces of plastic. That's because these small plastic particles can be ingested by even smaller organisms, so they can infiltrate into lower levels of the food chain, all the way down to invertebrate species. It's also because relative to their larger plastic analogues, they have a greater surface area. So when it comes to reporting concentrations of chemicals either leaching out of or absorbed to the surface of plastic particles, the smaller they are, the greater proportion or the greater the total loading of these harmful chemicals that is either being attached to or could be attached to or lost from them. So they have a potentially greater chemical impact and a potentially greater biological impact. The majority of these textile fibres, though, the majority of these microplastic particles, though, are textile fibres associated with things like polyester, acrylic, and nylon. Tony, could just click through to the next slide, please. Just to the first image, yeah, just stop there. Yeah, so early on in my research, I undertook a study looking at a river that falls in the same, or a series of rivers that fall in the same catchment as the River Churnet that Deirdre and Carrie have mentioned. So the River Trent and two of its tributaries. This piece of work actually started looking for those microplastic particles, whether they were fibres or original fragments. And what I was quite surprised to find out was that actually a lot of the textile fibres I was looking at under the microscope didn't conform to the morphology and the expected appearance of the plastic textile fibres I was looking for. I did a bit more digging, and I found out that these textile fibres that were dominating my samples were actually natural fibres, particularly cotton, and that these natural textile fibres, when you look under the microscope, actually have very distinct morphologies. When I actually did the analysis on this work, I found that the extent to which natural textile fibres dominated was upwards of 80 and even over 95%, depending on the different environmental matrices I was looking at. So I was looking at not just the water itself, but also the deposition from the atmosphere within the catchment. I want to stress something here, though, that this is the first time that this was quantified, fully quantified in the environmental sciences. But that's not to say it's that's not to say it's the first time it's been reported. Because if you look in complementary disciplines, particularly in the forensic science literature, where our colleague Kelly particularly works, this has been known for a very long time. We're talking about back to the 70s. People have known that natural textile fibres dominate the textile fibre populations of the environment. That communication between the two different scientific disciplines, though, still really hasn't started to progress as much as it should. So a key publication associated with this, if Tony can just click once more, is this paper here. This is an opinion piece that first suggests the potential impact of natural textile fibres as problem particles in the environment. And this was published in 2015. So that just gives you an idea of sort of the slow pace, I suppose, that this natural textile fibre discussion has moved relative to the microplastic one. It was first suggested in 2015, and it took 4 years before an environmental science paper quantified an entire textile fibre population in this way. So if Tony could just click through to, there we go, just stop there. So this has this observation of natural textile fibres dominating has been reported all over the world now off the back of that work. So here we found it in different environmental matrices, in this case, the guano of penguins in South Georgia. And if Tony just clicks once more, the samples of surface water from oceans all around the world are presented here. So that blue bar on the graph on the left is cellulosic fibres, orange is animal fibres, and the yellow is our synthetic textile fibres. These are kind of the two first papers that picked up on that 2019 work I mentioned, but it's been presented in soil environments, in atmospheric deposition, and river environments as well, all over the world now. So if Tony could click through once more, this is what I was referring to when I was talking about the different morphologies of these different textile fibre types under the microscope. So the cotton on the left and the wool in the middle didn't look anything like the polyester on the right. This means that actually you can go a long way to identify natural textile fibres without complicated and expensive instruments. But unfortunately, I've also seen a lot of microplastic publications that have presented photographs of these fibres and assumed them to be plastic, partly because there is this widely held assumption that natural textile fibres are biodegrading. And that level of textile fibre identification is not built into the microplastic analytical process. So how do these textile fibres get into the environment? If Tony could just click through once to the next slide. Thank you very much. As Deirdre's alluded to, laundry is a major pathway. So this can be from the direct laundering of our clothes, textile fibres coming off in the washing machine, making their way to wastewater treatment plants, and then getting through the wastewater treatment plant systems, passing through the liquid effluent into their receiving waters, whether that's lakes, rivers, or the ocean. We also know that these textile fibres are more often than not, in fact, incorporated into the biosolid product, so the solid products associated with wastewater treatment. The greater proportion, and by quite a way, over 70% in most cases, of textile fibres are actually finding their way into these sediments. Now, these sediments may be burned, they may be sent to landfill, but they're also often applied to agricultural land as fertilizer. So there's a route of these natural textile fibres and plastic textile fibres to agricultural terrestrial environments They may stay there and cause problems there, or they may be washed into our waterways when it rains as well. Now, this is the kind of the widely recognized model of textile fiber pathways from laundry. But it is really not representative of global laundry practices. And so myself, Deirdre, and Tony have also done some work looking at alternative pathways where wastewater infrastructure, the infrastructure to support this level of laundry electrification is not possible, is not available. So if Tony could just click once more. Working in an international team and across disciplines of geography, ethnography, forensic science, to name a few, we explored the relative contributions of hand washing practices which may happen in water bodies, on the side of water bodies, or even in some manual washing machines, but that crucially do not have discharges to wastewater treatment infrastructure, practices that discharge their laundry effluent directly into the environment. Now, whereas with the electrified laundry literature, there are several recommendations about how laundry can be modified to minimize fiber shed. We very much fell on the side of that's not appropriate when we're discussing these hand laundry or non-electrified laundry processes. So this paper that we worked on actually reflected on the design of clothing. How is clothing, or more specifically, how are garments constructed, and what influence might that have on the shedding of textile fibers when we remove all of the different variables that come from different laundry practices. And what we conclude is that the role of designers in intercepting textile fiber shedding into the environment is currently really underplayed in the academic and industrial literature, and that too much of a responsibility is placed on the consumer of these garments that doesn't reflect the realities of global laundry practices. If Tony could just click through once more. So we've got, hold it there. Oh, sorry, go back one, Tony. So does the presence of these natural textile fibers mean that they're a problem? Are you able to go back one, Tony? No worries. If not, I can talk around it. So a key distinction here is that textile fibers that are made from cotton, or textiles that are made from cotton, are made from cellulose fibers. And cellulose is indeed a polymer that's naturally found in the environment. However, the modifications that these textile fibers undergo to make them suitable for clothing or textiles actually change the polymeric structure. And so the type of cellulose that's found in a cotton garment is not the same as the cellulose that comes from the cotton plant. These modifications actually increase the thermal stability of the polymer itself and make it more resistant to degradation. So we have cellulose 1 is the polymer that's found in the cotton plant, but it's cellulose 2 that's actually in the garment. So we have a different polymer that's not found very readily in the environment, just like our plastic polymers. We also have lots of additives that are used in the textile industry. Carrie gave a lovely explanation of some of the potential for natural dyes. But a lot of these synthetic dyes actually cross-link with the polymer. So if Tony, could you click twice, please? Yep, so we've got cross-linking dyes, particularly blues and blacks, that strengthen the polymer further and make it even more resistant to degradation of any sort. We also have a lot of additives that we introduce to our clothing for things like antimicrobial resistance or flame retardants. In the case of antimicrobial resistance, we often use silver nanoparticles. So these are a sort of triple threat. Not only have we got the textile fibers themselves, but we have nanoparticles, which we know are problematic. And these nanoparticles are made of silver, which we know is a polluting heavy metal. So yes, the presence of these natural textile fibers does mean a problem. The extent of that problem we don't know, and the relative extent of that problem compared to our plastic fibers that there has been extensive research on is really, really not well known. But that being said, there has been some work that has looked at the ecotoxicological impacts of natural textile fibers alongside plastic. If you could just click through, please, Tony. Or once more, sorry. Yeah, and again, there we go. So this is just one paper. It's one of a handful, but they are out there that has looked at the influence of cotton, polyester, and polypropylene fibres under different environmental conditions and for 2 different organisms. The take home here, I appreciate this is quite a small figure when it's placed on this slide, is that they did find a difference, and that the extent of the impact of these different fiber types varied with the organism, it varied with the concentration, and it varied with the salinity of the water that we're exposed to. Key here is that the environmental impacts to organisms that ingest natural and synthetic textile fibers varies considerably depending on how or the simulated environment under which we expose them to. So there's a lot to learn. This is very much an emerging field. Tony, if you could just click through to my last slide, please. So since 2015, we published this paper a couple of months ago, actually, that was kind of in response to that 2015 publication that I introduced towards the start, and it's in the same journal. And what it shows is that since that 2015 paper, doing a literature search within this field, the number of publications that have been associated with synthetic textile fibres or plastic textile fibres has absolutely skyrocketed. But the equivalent that have looked at natural textile fibres is lagging really far behind. So this is still something that we're really not talking about. When we factor that into sustainable fashion narratives, however, we have some real problems because there's a lot of work being done promoting natural textile fibres as green alternatives, and we just simply do not have the data. So that's the background. I think I may have run over time. Apologies, but I'm now going to pass over to Tony, who will be able to take you through the Restoring Riverscapes project.
Thank you, Tom, and sorry for quickly skipping through some of your images there. Thanks, Tom, for providing that background about why it's so important that we start to look at natural textile fibres in the environment. What I would like to do before I dive into the Riverscapes research and project in a bit more detail is provide a little bit of a background about why freshwater aquatic systems are so important, particularly lakes, and to have a think about why the lake sediment record is an invaluable tool for us to have a look at the impact of natural textile fibres on the environment. So to kick off, why are aquatic environments so important? Well, if you were to take a teaspoon of water from this lake and put it under a microscope, you would see literally thousands of microorganisms, similar to these little circular algae here, known as diatoms on this left-hand area of the slide here. And they're fundamentally important because they're the building blocks of these lake ecosystems. These diatoms are basically microscopic plants, and they are eaten by zooplankton, which are eaten by fish. And fundamentally, lakes also provide really essential ecosystem functions. So the processes that operate in the lakes are really important for the environment. So for example, lakes allow a lot of nutrients to be recycled in the environment. They also trap a lot of sediments and contaminants, and they buffer against the damaging effects of climate change. And really important is that they provide something called ecosystem services, which basically means that when lakes are healthy and well maintained and in good quality, they provide essential services for humans. So a key example of that would be for drinking water, for fisheries, for aquaculture, and for recreation and leisure. However, these aquatic systems are increasingly under threat from climate change and pollution. So I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the media and the fact that we're seeing more and more of these algal blooms. So these green algal blooms on lakes and rivers and reservoirs that are the consequence of either fertilizer being washed in from agricultural land or from industrial inputs from urban areas that cause these massive blooms of algae and can be very damaging to the rest of the ecosystem. Large increases in the amount of plastic we see in our aquatic systems. So this is important because this plastic breaks down into these microplastics that Tom has been talking about, but also there's so much we don't know about the impacts in terms of these plastics on these ecosystems. So for example, we know that they leach nasty chemicals and pollutants, and they also act as a new habitat for a lot of microorganisms in these systems, and very little is known. And then obviously increasingly we're seeing more and more textile fibre pollution from urban areas, primarily from washing machines, from wastewater treatment plants, as Tom has highlighted. But we don't really know the full impacts. And we don't really know whether or not they're preserved in the historic record. So this is why we get to where lake sediment records are important and where we started our Riverscapes project. So everything that washes into a lake system, be it soils and sediments from the edges of the lakes, leaves, dead plant material, or everything that lives within the lake, when it dies, such as the algae, eventually falls to the bottom of the lake, and it builds up over time, like multiple layers of cake building up at the bottom of the lake. And in this respect, we can be a bit like Doctor Who. We can go back in time and we can use lake sediment records as time machines. So we can take the sediments from the bottom of the lake and we can investigate lots of different lines of evidence to look at how that lake system has changed in response to climate and in response to pollution. And I've got a really quick video here to show you how we take lake sediment records. We can either go out on a boat like we do with Riverscapes, or you can actually walk out onto lakes, particularly in Arctic areas where there's lots of ice. And you have to drill a big hole through the ice using a big corkscrew, as is being demonstrated here. And then you place a sediment corer which descends through the water column under gravity until it hits the lake sediment record where it penetrates into the mud. And then you can effectively pull the lake sediment record up to the surface so that we can take it back to the lab and investigate it, as is being shown here. And then when we get into the lab, there's a range of different things we can do to go back in time to look at how these lake ecosystems have changed in response to climate or pollution. So for example, we can look at the microscopic fossils called diatoms that are trapped in the lake sediment records that give us an indication about how the water quality has changed or how pollutants may have impacted them. We can look at the sedimentary evidence. We can look at the minerals, the elements and the chemicals, or the amount of carbon in the lake sediment cores and how that's changed over time. And in contemporary lake systems today, we can go out and take water samples, as shown here on the right-hand side, and just look at the water quality or look for the presence of pollutants and microfibres. And it would look something like this if we were to plot it up. So here on the left-hand side, we have the sediment core. The key thing here is that the youngest sediment is at the top. As we go down the core, we go back in time. So here is an example of a lake actually from Greenland that's 10,000 years old. And here, these black lines are the different diatom species that are indicative of different types of water quality. And here we have a change in nutrients. And as we can see, we've got much more nutrients lower down the core. And that coincides with the shift to this diatom here, because the lake is effectively becoming much less concentrated in nutrients and it's becoming more oligotrophic. And we can do a very similar thing if we wanted to have a look at whether or not textile fibres were preserved in lakes. So really the take-home message from these first slides is that we can use lake sediment records as a time machine to go back in time to have a look at how the environment has changed. And this got us thinking about whether or not we could do this with natural textile fibres, with Tom, Deirdre, Carrie, and the rest of the team. And we wanted to think about whether or not we could use these lake sediment records to look at whether or not we could find microfibres and have a look at them as technofossils. And just a quick summary of what we mean by technofossils for those of you that may not be familiar. They are materials manufactured by people that are preserved in archaeological and paleo records, so very similar to the lake sediment records I've been outlining. They provide an invaluable insight into human activity through time, and they can highlight the diverse and enduring impacts of people on the environment. And in the case of microfibres, they can reflect whether or not there's been biodegradability in the sedimentary matrices. So we decided to get together as a team and form the Riverscapes project. We decided that we would look for sites that were downstream of historic textile mills. So within the Leek area in the Peak District, we dug out a load of historical maps and we identified ancient and historical mill sites that were upstream of lake water bodies. And we identified Rudyard Lake as a perfect site because upstream it had a feeder stream that historically had run past a textile mill and would have likely been transporting these natural textile fibres. We then took our sediment core. Okay, again, remember that the youngest sediment's on the top, the oldest sediment's on the bottom. And the first thing we had to do when we got to the lab is we had a 19 centimetre core. We subsampled it every centimetre. So we sliced it into 1 centimetre samples. And Tom and I, along with Chimdia and Kelly up in Northumbria, devised a new methodology for extracting these fibres from the core. So typically when we extract plastic textile fibres from the core, synthetic fibres, we use a lot of harsh chemicals which can actually degrade or damage or lose a lot of the fibres in the lab. And we didn't want to do that because we thought if we have natural textile fibres in here, they're going to be pretty vulnerable to that. So we developed a non-chemical technique that involved lots of sieving, lots of trial runs to extract these natural fibres, and they were identified by Chimdia in the lab. And this is the preliminary data that we would like to share with you today. We're still waiting for some dates so that we know exactly how old this sediment core is, but we do know that at around 11 to 12 centimetres, that can be dated to approximately 1950. I'm not sure if you can actually see the legend at the bottom here, because I can't actually see it on my slide, but what we can see is a dominance of natural textile fibres before 1950. So green is wool and purple is cotton. But after 1950, we see an increase in the amount of synthetic fibres, which are the yellow and orange, which is nylon, and acrylic, which is blue. And not only do we see an increase in the quantity of fibres, but we also see this shift to more synthetic fibres. Okay, and we're still writing up this paper at the moment, so this is very much the preliminary data. But this shows us a few things. This shows us that natural textile fibres are preserved in the lake sediment record. They haven't biodegraded, as people suspect that they had. So this gives us an opportunity to not only look at how historical textile mills have pumped out lots of textile fibres into the freshwater environment, but it also allows us to look at how they biodegrade in these environments and to see whether or not there's any leaching from any of the dyes or chemicals that have been added. So a few take-home points from this presentation between Tom and myself. We need to think about all fibres, not just plastic fibres in the environment. Natural textile fibres frequently dominate environmental samples, but they're incredibly overlooked in the research literature. Natural textile fibres apparently don't biodegrade, as our research shows, and can persist for a long time. And it's essential that we have interdisciplinary working to understand the impacts of textile fibre pollution. The research at Rudyard highlights just one way the fashion industry is impacting the aquatic environment in the past and also today. But much more research is required into the holistic impacts of the fashion industry and textile water industries in aquatic waterways. Apologies also if I've overrun a little bit, and thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Tom, for explaining this really complex subject so well and actually frightening us a bit, because we always have presumed that natural fibers are the safest to use and are completely biodegradable. But like you said, much more research needed. So the next part of our webinar, Antonia, I think you'll have to stop screen sharing. Thank you. The next part of our webinar is a conversation with Khatri Abdul Rauf Abdul Razak, who lives and works in Ajrakpul village in Kutch, Gujarat. Part of a 10th generation family of traditional hand block printers and natural dyers, he was taught and trained by his father, Abdul Razak Muhammad, Bhai Siddiqui Bhai Khatri, a renowned national award winner. Educated up to the 9th grade, Rauf has became an expert block printer by the age of 14. He is also an expert woodblock carver, the tool of his trade. Before I start with the question and answer, I just want to give a brief background on Rauf Bhai and his family and community's work, which is a block print heritage textile known as Ajrak. The Ajrak's complex geometric and floral patterns form a part of the cultural and clothing identity of pastoralist communities spread across Kutch in Gujarat, the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, right up to Sindh in Pakistan. Over the years, this block print has transformed into a cosmopolitan textile used in urban India and overseas. As a resist and modern dyed textile, often block printed on both sides of the cloth. Its over 16 processes require repeat immersions in water. In the year 2001, a devastating earthquake took lives and impacted livelihoods in the area. In the post-disaster recovery, the Khatri communities of block printers and dyers planned a move to a new area, a 40-kilometer distance from their original village of Dhamarka. That farmland was christened Ajrakpur, a name based on their heritage textiles. So this is a brief background on Rauf Bhai, and I'm going to speak to him in Hindi and then translate. My first question to him is that given the vast need for water, how does the community in Ajrakpur decide on what to do about their issues of water supply and water disposal? The Rauf Bhai, मेरा
जी
पहला प्रश्न है
जी
कि अजरकपुर में सेटल होने के बाद समाज ने पानी का इस्तेमाल और पानी का डिस्पोजल के मुद्दे के बारे में क्या और कैसे फैसला किया? आप
जी
हमें
बहुत अच्छा। सबसे पहले तो अजरकपुर में जब हम लोग आ गए तो यहाँ पे एक थी कि वॉशिंग के लिए एक एरिया था। जब हम लोग वॉशिंग करने जाते थे तो सब कारीगर का एक ही एरिया था कि आपको वहीं पे वॉशिंग करना है, और एक बोरवेल था जिसमें से पानी आ रहा था, लेकिन वो हर साल 15 फीट 20 फीट नीचे जा रहा था पानी। तो सब कम्युनिटी वाले ने मिलके और स्पेशल हमारे चाचा डॉक्टर इस्माइल भाई ने ये प्लान किया कि भाई हर साल पानी नीचे जा रहा है तो हम पानी कितना खींचेंगे, हम कुछ ऐसा प्लान करें कि पानी ज्यादा न खींचना पड़े और उसी पानी को रिसाइकलिंग करें हम लोग। तो ये मिलके एक थोड़ा ये सोच रहे थे कि हम ये इसको उसी पानी को रिसाइकलिंग करें ताकि पानी नीचे से हम न खींच सके ज्यादा।
So what Rauf Bhai says is that when they moved to Ajrakpur, the whole Samaj, their community got together and they said, let us only wash our fabrics and our processes in one community area. Let's not spread this across. So that is what they did. But then what they found was that they were pumping this water up, that every year the water level went down by 15 meters, by 20 meters. They just had to keep digging deeper. So they came together and said, let us work on a system where we don't waste water and we recycle this water and we work for the environment and the climate and not dig deeper. तो फिर रौफ भाई क्या किया आपने? अगला स्टेप बताइए।
हाँ, अगला स्टेप के लिए हमने पहला एक छोटा सा रिसाइकलिंग का प्लान लगाया जो बैक्टीरिया से बनता था, और वो छोटा प्लान था 15-20 हजार लीटर का। तो उसमें बैक्टीरिया हम डालते थे और वो नेचुरल डाइस का जो कलर का हमारा पानी होता था उस कलर को खा जाता था और उसको रिसाइकलिंग कर रहा था। लेकिन उसमें प्रॉब्लम ये हुआ कि वो बैक्टीरिया को हीट ज्यादा मिल रही थी क्योंकि हमारा कच्छ का जो एरिया है वो थोड़ा हीट वेव वाला है, तो ठंडक उसको जितनी बैक्टीरिया को चाहती थी उतनी नहीं मिल रही थी। तो वो पहला वाला जो था हमारा प्लान वो इतना सक्सेसफुली नहीं गया।
तो मैं बताऊँ। So they set up a water filtration and cleaning plant that required the use of bacteria. Now in Ajrakpur, they use only natural dyes. And this bacteria attacked the natural dyes and it cleansed out the water. So it came out when it looked clear and it could be used again. But Ajrakpur, don't forget, is in a kind of desert area and it is very hot there. And even though they had spent this huge amount of funds and everything else, the bacteria didn't do its job well enough because the environment was too hot. And so they had to look for another solution. So फिर क्या किया रौफ भाई?
तो उसके बाद इस्माइल चाचा ने बहुत सारा रिसर्च किया और कुछ एनजीओ से बात की, गवर्नमेंट से बात की, तो उनको ये जो प्लान है ईटीपी वाला वो उन्होंने देखा, तो फंडिंग उसके लिए गवर्नमेंट से मिली और ईटीपी प्लान लगाया। और इसके 6-7 प्रोसेस होता है, कुछ केमिकल डालना पड़ता है, फिर उसमें चूने का पानी, पॉली इलेक्ट्रिक, फर्टिलाइजर, बहुत सारे उसमें डालने पड़ते हैं 1 बाय 1 प्रोसेस के अंदर। तो वो सक्सेसफुल हुआ और उसमें केमिकल का पानी हो, नेचुरल का पानी हो, सब वो फिल्टर हो जाता है और पर डे 50,000 लीटर 8 घंटे में रिसाइकलिंग होता है।
Oh my God. ठीक है, मुझे बताने दो ये 8 घंटे में. So they started looking around again. Now Rauf Bhai's father's brother, his chacha, Ismail Bhai Khatri, he is actually leads the Samaj or the community. So he started speaking to the NGOs in the area. He started speaking to local government, state government, and to the central government, and researching and looking at what would suit them in the best possible way. And with a large grant from the government, so by the way, their community gave the land. So that is quite remarkable also, because it requires a lot of land, plus pipelines to take the water to the plant. They set up another effluent plant. Now, this plant requires 6 or 7 processes to cleanse the water. It works not only for natural dyes, but also for chemical dyes. It cleanses the water, sends it back to their workshops where they reuse it, and it processes 50,000 liters in 8 hours. Now, Rauf bhai, 1 minute, मैं अहमद को कहने वाली हूँ वो PPT दिखाए. Ahmed, can you show us the photos of the effluent plant, please? So this is where it is, and you can see the pictures from the outside, and yeah, you can go on to the next. This is the inside, and you can see the fields and the pipes and their homes around the place. Thank you, Emma. So Rauf bhai, मेरा आखिरी सवाल. अब हम 2024 में हैं.
जी.
आपको और क्या चाहिए? इससे बेहतर क्या चाहिए कि इससे ही satisfied हो? So let me tell you what my question is. Rauf bhai, 1 minute. So my question to Rauf bhai is that we are now in 2024. This plant was set up in 2019. Are you satisfied? Is the Samaj, the community, satisfied? Would you like a change? And what kind of change would you like? Rauf bhai?
जी, ये हुआ है वो बहुत अच्छा हुआ है, लेकिन इससे बेहतर होना चाहिए, इससे बड़ा भी होना चाहिए, ताकि अभी वर्कशॉप बढ़ रहे हैं, फैसिलिटीज भी उसके हिसाब से बढ़नी चाहिए, ताकि लोगों को जो पानी हम इस्तेमाल करते हैं वही पानी रिसाइकलिंग होके हम दोबारा इस्तेमाल कर हम सके. तो इससे बड़ा प्लान का हम भी हैं कि भविष्य में हो.
चलो ये हो जाए आपके लिए. So what Rauf bhai says is that, you know, the popularity of their block print is now so international that every time I travel there, they're going to Japan, to Korea. They're just traveling around the world in exhibitions and demonstrations, that there are many more workshops as children grow up. So they need a bigger plant. They want to have more water being recycled. And this is just not enough. So Rauf bhai, I hope कि ये हो जाए, और बहुत आदाब और thank you कि आप आए. So thank you. So this has been an amazing hour, and we've actually gone over an hour. And what I so admire about all the panelists, the speakers, is your commitment to pushing boundaries and to making a difference. And I'm sure there are lots of questions. So if you could all please unmute, I will open the floor for some questions that have come in. Well, the first thing is a comment which requests if all the speakers could please put links to the papers you have written or referred to for others to read. So that is a request I'm putting forward. And the first question is to you, Deirdre, and that is, what and how does textile contribute in the after effects in water calamities? Which fibers are you usually come out in this?
Okay, well, I think that's a research question, because when you have a catastrophic flood event and you have a lot of sediment flow, it does stir things up. And it may be that some of the fibers that are persistent and have problematic chemicals absorbed to them are mobilized into the system. So it could be a combination of our durable synthetic fibers and also our problematic natural fibers. As Tom's presentation, I hope, made clear, and talking about the water column data and Tony's sediment data, that there are some natural fibers that are probably going to behave almost like synthetics in the sort of ecological systems. So somebody's asked me, what's better? And it depends on a variety of things. And I would point you back to Carrie's research with naturally colored natural fibers, which aren't chemically modified, and say that that's the sort of fiber that is most likely to be least problematic in a natural system, because it's evolved in that system without really, really significant human interference. Whether or not the affordances that we need from our textiles, whether we can adapt to that, I saw somebody mentioning using secondhand, and that definitely reduces our consumption. But as Tom said, we also need to be very sensitive about our practices of textile care. And then when we do have climate-related flood and debris flow, sediment mobilization calamities, the textile contribution will be lower. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Deirdre. And actually that half answers the next question, which is addressed to Tom and to Antonia. And the question is, between natural and synthetic fibers and waterways, is there a better or worse option?
I think my response to that would be to kind of reiterate what I said about is just not knowing what the environmental impacts of natural textile fibers are. Unfortunately, there aren't the data in the scientific literature to do the comparisons needed to answer that question. And this is where I think sort of applying the precautionary principle in so much as following what Deirdre's just said about minimizing consumption and keeping garments in their use phase for as long as possible, but also being sensitive to that kind of global commodity chain and the different practices across the world are really, really key for as long as possible. Just only using what we need is the best course of action. And I would certainly recommend ask yourself whether or not you need to buy it, rather than whether you should buy the natural or the plastic version of it.
Antonia, would you like to add something?
No, I think Tom has answered that in exactly the same way that I would, that, we're at a point where at the moment there's just still so many unknowns, and that, a lot of it is driven by, behavior really. And just to reiterate what Tom said about thinking more sustainably about the choices and whether or not you need to purchase something or whether or not you can keep reusing it fundamentally. So no, I think that was thanks, Tom.
Carrie, there's a question for you. In terms of buying new, what would you recommend for sustainable fashion advocates or people who are trying to be more sustainable in their clothing purchases? Would you say that secondhand is the best option?
Well, I think there's a lot of research that shows that actually the first wash is the greatest when it comes to microfiber shedding. So secondhand, those fibres will already have shed the greatest quantities. So if we're specifically looking at microfibres, then yes, secondhand, I would say, and I'm not the scientist here, but I would say probably up to a certain stage, because then when clothes get too old, when you wash them, they're probably going to be shedding more when they do start to fall apart. But yes, secondhand is certainly a really good option when it comes to microfibres. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that.
So next question is again for Tom and Antonia. Human hair and silk are similar in nature. Did you find hair specimens in lake sediments? What is the biodegradation duration for hair?
That is a very interesting question. So we didn't specifically look for hairs, for human hair. I believe there were a few fibres that we thought may be silk, but we're still trying to verify some of those samples. And you make a really interesting point that, we know that silk is pretty vulnerable to sort of rapidly biodegrading. And we certainly didn't find much. There's the odd fibre that we're sort of trying to verify a little bit more. So one thing that was quite interesting though is that we came across a lot of fibres that we thought were natural textile fibres. And once you start to look at them in a bit more detail under the microscope, they can sometimes just be pieces of organic matter from like plants and vegetation. So that was one thing for me that we thought was quite interesting. But I can't really add much more about how long it takes hair to break down, because unfortunately it's not something that we've looked at. I don't know if Tom can add anything to that.
Only to say that the closest analog, I suppose, that we could confidently identify were the wool fibres, so obviously still keratin, and I think this sort of the question that's been asked raises the point that's also of relevance to Carrie's response just now, in that when these textile fibres do biodegrade, they still have a chemical load, and it's that chemical load of the fibre that's being introduced into the environment, if they do biodegrade, that is also not being considered either in the scientific discipline or scientific disciplines, or in the industry and the communication around it. And we mustn't forget that the environmental footprint of a textile fibre is not, sorry, of a garment is not just the textile fibres that are associated with it. It's the water consumption and the pollution that's associated with its manufacture, and the potential release of chemicals as they biodegrade. And in the case of keratin-based fibres, things like wool, we do know that polymerically, that keratin is, as you would find on the sheep, unlike for cotton, where you've got different forms of cellulose. So we would expect it to be biodegrading more readily. Massive caveat there that we haven't tested this scientifically. It is still something we need to know, but that essentially would be a research question I would love to explore.
I think you all answered the next question, but I'm going to pose it in any case. How does a natural cotton change in its composition when it becomes a textile? Is it not because of the chemical dyes that are used to process the cotton before it is made into a textile?
Am I right to take that one?
If you think there's something left unanswered, please do.
Yeah, sorry. So I skirted over this perhaps a little bit quickly in the presentation. You're absolutely right. There are dyes that are actually introduced to a cotton textile fibre, which give it the colour and change its chemistry through the associations of what's actually bound to the surface. There are lots of different types of dyes, though, that actually interact with the fibres in different ways. And I'm not a textile scientist or a dye expert, so I shan't even attempt to try and elaborate on them. But the key thing to know is that certain dyes bond more strongly to the actual cellulose backbone of the cotton fibre than others. And these are the ones that I referred to that are cross-linking, that can be more problematic because they add extra strength and structure to the fibre. The key thing that I think I skirted over a bit more quickly, and this was where we had the slight issue with the slide in terms of going back, is that the cellulose polymer, so the chemical structure of the cellulose, changes through the process of mercerization. So whenever cotton is mercerized for textile applications, the raw atoms that are in the molecule stay the same in terms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. But their orientation and the way that they interact with each other and the molecular forces that go on between, atomic forces that go on between the atoms in that cellulose molecule change. So at a molecular level, these interactions actually increase the stability of cotton, the thermal stability, so it's harder to break down in the environment. And crucially, biologically, there's very little in the environment that is used to being exposed to cellulose too. So the the bacteria that we might expect to break down the cellulose that's come straight from the cotton plant, that can also manage with the grass and the leaves that fall to the ground and the trees that fall, is dealing with a different polymer, chemically a different polymer, when it's looking at a piece of mercerized cotton, and so it has to behave differently. And again, I'm not a microbiologist, so I'm going to stop explaining there. But that's kind of where, as far as I've got to from talking to people who work in those spaces. It's not just the dyes though with cotton.
Thank
you. I think it's also worth adding, if I may, because I realise that there's a gap we've sort of all left out of our presentations as well, because I mentioned at the beginning that Leek was really well known for silk. And so obviously people would think we might be finding silk, but in doing the research and finding that most of these fibres in the lake sediment were cotton, I was trying to sort of piece together some of that backstory along with Deirdre. And it looks likely that a lot of that cotton actually came from the paper making. There's a couple of paper making mills upstream or up the feeder stream. So these would have been cotton and linen rags. So they had already been processed, made into clothing, worn as clothing, fallen apart, and then recycled into paper. They would have come into direct contact with the water there. And then there would be all sorts of glues and sizes and different chemicals used in the paper making process as well. So we've almost got sort of double processing there.
Thank you for that. Our last question is to Rauf Bhai. Rauf Bhai, किसी ने प्रश्न पूछा है कि आप नेचुरल डाइज इस्तेमाल करते हैं कि नेचुरल भी और केमिकल भी?
नेचुरली इस्तेमाल करते हैं, लेकिन कुछ चीजें ऐसी होती हैं जिसको हम एजोफ्रिक कलर भी बोल सकते हैं, जिसमें एलिजरीन और इंडिको।
ओके।
और उसके अलावा के जितने भी होते हैं वो 100% प्योर होते हैं। चूना है, गूंद है, मंजिष्ठा है, आल का जड़ है, दाड़म की छाल है, हल्दी है, वो बाकी सब नेचुरल होता है, प्योर। लेकिन ये दोनों में भी हम नेचुरल यूज करते हैं, लेकिन ऑर्डर के ऊपर रहता है। अगर किसी को कम रेंज वाला है तो ये जो सिंथेटिक है इंडिको वो यूज करते हैं। अगर किसी को रेड कलर में चाहिए प्योर वाला तो मेडल रूट में बना के दे सकते हैं, और अगर केमिकल वाला है तो एलिजरीन में बना के दे सकते हैं।
So the question that was asked to Rauf is, do you use natural dyes or chemical dyes? So he said they largely use natural dyes, turmeric, madder root, and others. But sometimes when deeper shades of red are needed, they use azo-free dyes like alizarin and some indigo powders. But otherwise, largely they use a wide range of natural dyes. So thank you. And we are now at the end. We've actually run over time. And before I conclude, a big thanks to supporters and funders for underwriting the webinar and the Leek Textile Week. These include the National Lottery through Arts Council England and the funding and support from Outside Arts and from Neela House, Lady Bamford Foundation. A huge thanks to the panelists for sharing their knowledge and adding to all our learning. A thank you to the attendees for being so marvelous and not dropping off at all, and for responding to our polls. And please, to all of you, keep checking our website and Instagram for all those wonderful events that are lined up from the 23rd. A big thanks to my co-directors, Carrie and Sol, our advisory board, and all my colleagues. So thank you again, and I hope we have you all back again very soon. Thank you. Adab, Rovkai, and thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.